Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for over 15 years, navigating thousands of episodes with his signature blend of humor, warmth, and genuine connection with the families who appeared on his stage. Throughout his extensive career in television, he had witnessed the complete spectrum of human emotion and family dynamics, from heartwarming celebrations of partnership and mutual support to uncomfortable moments when underlying resentment and disrespect surfaced during the pressure of competition. However, nothing in his considerable experience could have prepared him for what would unfold on that May afternoon in 2024, when a husband's public mockery of his wife's career would cross every line of acceptable conduct and trigger an immediate and powerful response from Steve that would halt the game completely and deliver one of the most pointed lessons about respect, partnership, and the fundamental obligation to support the person who has chosen to share their life with you. The Harrison family from Boston, Massachusetts stood ready to compete against the Patel family from Chicago, Illinois. Both families having traveled to Los Angeles excited about their opportunity to participate in America's most beloved game show. Yet beneath the surface of rehearsed smiles and coordinated outfits, a pattern of contempt and dismissiveness was about to manifest in such a public way that it would stop production immediately and demonstrate that some behaviors are so fundamentally disrespectful that they require immediate confrontation regardless of the setting in which they occur. If you value stories that remind us of the critical importance of supporting our partners' ambitions and respecting their professional contributions regardless of how those contributions compare to our own achievements, please take a moment to engage with this content by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel for more powerful narratives about families and the choices that either strengthen or destroy the partnerships we claim to value. Brian and Lauren Harrison had been married for 14 years, though the partnership that had initially characterized their relationship had deteriorated significantly over the past several years in ways that would become tragically apparent through what was about to transpire on national television. Brian was 42 years old, a highly successful corporate attorney whose career at a prestigious Boston law firm had provided substantial financial comfort and social status for his family. He carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to professional achievement and recognition, his expensive tailored suit and polished appearance reflecting both his financial success and his attention to image and presentation. Lauren, 39, worked as an elementary school art teacher, a position she had pursued with passion and dedication despite the modest compensation associated with public school teaching positions. Her career choice reflected her genuine love for working with children and her belief in the importance of arts education in developing creativity and self-expression in young students. Their children completed the family lineup on the Family Feud stage. 12-year-old Emma stood near her parents with the careful awareness of a child who had learned to read subtle tensions in adult interactions and adjust her behavior accordingly. 9-year-old Nathan displayed enthusiasm about being on television that was tempered by visible anxiety, about how the experience might unfold given the dynamics he had observed between his parents in recent years. Brian's brother Michael, 38, rounded out the 5-person team, included in the Family Feud appearance at Lauren's request as someone who might provide some support and perhaps serve as a moderating influence on Brian's tendency toward dismissiveness and criticism when interacting with Lauren in social settings. What made the Harrison family situation particularly troubling was not a single dramatic crisis, but rather a pattern of behavior from Brian that had systematically undermined Lauren's sense of professional worth and personal value over the course of their marriage. When they had first married 14 years earlier, Brian had expressed support for Lauren's commitment to arts education and her dedication to making a difference in the lives of elementary students. However, as Brian's own career success had accelerated and his income had grown substantially beyond what Lauren earned as a public school teacher, his attitude toward her profession had shifted dramatically from respect and appreciation to subtle, and then increasingly overt dismissiveness and contempt. Brian had developed a pattern of making disparaging comments about Lauren's career choice and her professional contributions, suggesting that her work as an elementary art teacher was essentially a hobby rather than a real career, that her modest salary demonstrated the limited value society placed on what she did, and that her continued commitment to teaching despite the low compensation reflected a lack of ambition or unwillingness to pursue more financially rewarding professional opportunities. He would compare her unfavorably to his colleagues and their spouses who worked in high-paying professional fields, highlighting their career advancement and income growth in ways that made clear he viewed Lauren as inadequate and disappointing in comparison to the partners his professional peers had chosen. These criticisms extended beyond simple commentary about income disparity into fundamental dismissal of the value and importance of Lauren's work with children and her contributions to their development and education. Brian would make jokes at social gatherings about Lauren's career, suggesting that playing with finger paints and construction paper hardly constituted real work compared to the complex legal matters he handled daily. He would minimize her professional challenges and frustrations, implying that managing a classroom of elementary students was trivial compared to the high-stakes negotiations and litigation he navigated in his legal practice. He would dismiss her stories about successful lessons or meaningful connections with students, suggesting that such anecdotes were cute but ultimately reflected work that anyone could do, and that society rightfully compensated at levels reflecting its limited importance and skill requirements. Lauren had attempted multiple times to address this pattern of dismissiveness and contempt, expressing to Brian how his constant minimization of her career affected her sense of professional worth and her experience of their marriage as a partnership between equals. She had explained that while she understood and appreciated that his legal career generated substantially higher income than her teaching position, financial compensation was not the only or even the primary measure of professional value or societal contribution. She had described the profound impact that quality arts education had on children's development, creativity, and self-expression, arguing that her work was both challenging and important even if it was not financially lucrative or socially prestigious in the ways that corporate legal practice might be. Brian had consistently dismissed Lauren's concerns and objections, suggesting that she was being overly sensitive about his honest observations regarding the realities of career value and compensation in contemporary society. He would argue that he was simply acknowledging objective facts about income disparity and market valuation of different professional contributions, and that Lauren's emotional response to these facts reflected her own insecurity about her career choices rather than any actual problem with how he communicated about her work. This pattern of dismissal, followed by gaslighting about the legitimacy of her concerns, had left Lauren feeling increasingly isolated and uncertain about whether her perceptions were accurate or whether she was indeed being unreasonably sensitive about Brian's assessment of her professional contributions. The reality, which Lauren had begun to recognize with painful clarity through conversations with friends and through her own growing awareness of healthy relationship dynamics, was that Brian's behavior constituted a form of emotional abuse that was systematically destroying her sense of professional worth and personal value. His constant dismissiveness and mockery communicated that her work was meaningless and unimportant, that her contributions to society and to their family finances were negligible and hardly worth acknowledging, and that she should feel grateful that he tolerated her continued pursuit of such an unimpressive and poorly compensated career, rather than insisting she pursue something more financially rewarding or professionally prestigious. Lauren had reached a point where she was seriously questioning whether to remain in the marriage, recognizing that Brian's pattern of professional dismissiveness represented deeper issues with respect and partnership that were unlikely to change without intervention that he refused to pursue. She had suggested marriage counseling on numerous occasions, hoping that a professional third party might help Brian recognize how his constant mockery of her career was damaging their relationship and undermining the foundation of mutual respect that should characterize any healthy partnership. Brian had refused counseling each time, insisting that there was no relationship problem requiring professional intervention, and that Lauren simply needed to develop thicker skin and stop being so sensitive about honest observations regarding career value and compensation realities. The Family Feud appearance had been arranged through the school where Lauren taught, part of a community outreach program that highlighted educators and their families. Lauren had initially been excited about the opportunity, viewing it as a chance to represent teachers positively on national television and perhaps to demonstrate to Brian and their children that her work and her professional identity deserved recognition and celebration. However, as the taping date approached, her excitement had been tempered by anxiety about how Brian might behave on camera and whether his pattern of dismissiveness toward her career might manifest in this very public setting. Her concerns proved to be entirely justified in ways that exceeded even her worst expectations about what might occur during the taping. The game began with standard Family Feud energy and production quality, Steve Harvey engaging both families with his characteristic warmth and humor. The Patel family presented as genuinely supportive and connected, their interactions with each other demonstrating authentic encouragement and celebration of each family member's contributions to the game regardless of whether answers proved correct or appeared on the board. The Harrison family's dynamics were noticeably different from the beginning, with subtle tensions visible in how Brian and Lauren positioned themselves relative to each other, and in the minimal eye contact or physical affection between them. The first round proceeded with both families providing answers to the survey question with varying degrees of success. During a brief pause in gameplay when Steve Harvey was consulting with producers about the next segment, he engaged in casual conversation with the families, asking about their backgrounds and what brought them to Los Angeles for the taping. This type of conversational interlude was standard practice on Family Feud, providing opportunities for contestants to share interesting details about their lives and creating more personal connection between the families and the viewing audience. Steve turned his attention to the Harrison family and asked the group about their professional backgrounds, curious about what types of work they did and what had motivated them to apply for Family Feud. Lauren responded first, explaining with evident pride that she was an elementary school art teacher and that the show had reached out to her school as part of their initiative to highlight educators and their families. She spoke briefly about her love for working with children and her belief in the importance of arts education in developing creativity and critical thinking skills in young students. Brian's response to Lauren's professional description was immediate and devastating in its casual cruelty and public dismissiveness. Before Steve Harvey could respond to Lauren's explanation or express appreciation for her work as an educator, Brian interjected with a comment that was clearly intended as humor, but that revealed profound contempt for his wife's career and professional contributions. Brian stated with mock seriousness that he hoped the prize money from Family Feud might finally allow Lauren to quit her little art hobby and get a real job that actually contributed meaningfully to their family's financial situation and social standing. The words hung in the air as minds throughout the studio struggled to process what had just been said and the casual cruelty with which it had been delivered. Steve Harvey's expression transformed immediately from his usual warmth and humor to something that reflected profound offense and barely controlled anger at what he had just witnessed. The studio audience gasped collectively, the sound reflecting shock and dismay that someone would publicly mock and dismiss their spouse's career in such a devastating way, particularly when that career involved educating children and contributing to their development and growth. Lauren's face flushed deep red, a combination of humiliation and pain washing over her features as her husband's mockery of her professional life was broadcast to hundreds of people in the studio and would soon be heard by millions of viewers at home. Her eyes filled with tears, though she fought desperately to maintain composure and dignity in the face of such public disrespect. Emma and Nathan stood frozen beside their parents, their young faces reflecting confusion and distress as they heard their father publicly diminish and mock the work that their mother clearly valued and found meaningful. Steve Harvey stood completely motionless for several seconds that stretched uncomfortably long, his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on Brian Harrison with an intensity that communicated profound displeasure with what had just occurred. When Steve finally spoke, his voice had lost all traces of the jovial game show host persona, and instead carried the weight and authority of a man who had lived long enough and experienced enough to recognize genuine disrespect and contempt when it presented itself before him. Steve told Brian in no uncertain terms that he needed to stop right there, that what he had just said about his wife and her career was completely unacceptable and would not be allowed to pass without immediate and direct confrontation. Steve made clear that he was stopping the game to address what had just occurred, because what Brian had said went far beyond typical family banter or playful teasing, and crossed into territory of genuine cruelty and disrespect that could not be ignored or minimized regardless of whether Brian characterized his comment as a joke or honest observation. Steve articulated specifically what Brian had done wrong, ensuring there could be no confusion or attempt to minimize or reframe the situation. He described how Brian had called his wife's career a little art hobby rather than acknowledging it as legitimate professional work. How he had suggested that her 13 years of dedicated teaching were not a real job worthy of respect and recognition. How he had implied that her contributions to their family were negligible, and that she needed to pursue different work in order to contribute meaningfully to their financial situation and social standing. Steve made absolutely clear that this characterization was not only factually wrong, but profoundly disrespectful to Lauren as a professional, and as a partner who deserved support and appreciation rather than mockery and dismissal. Brian attempted to respond with his familiar pattern of deflection and minimization, suggesting that Steve was overreacting to an innocent joke, and that everyone was being overly sensitive about what he had intended as lighthearted humor about the income disparity between his legal career and Lauren's teaching position. He attempted to frame his comment as simple acknowledgement of economic realities rather than dismissive mockery of his wife's professional contributions and choices. This attempt to reframe and deflect only intensified Steve's response, as he made clear that there was no interpretation of Brian's comment that made it acceptable or appropriate. Steve told Brian that he needed to understand something fundamental about marriage and partnership that he had clearly lost sight of or perhaps never properly understood. He explained that when you marry someone, you take on an obligation to support and respect that person's professional choices and contributions, regardless of how those choices compare to your own career in terms of income generation or social prestige. He described how partnership required genuine appreciation for what each person brought to the relationship and to the family, whether those contributions came in the form of high income, dedicated parenting, household management, or in Lauren's case, meaningful work educating and inspiring young children even if that work was not highly compensated financially. Steve turned his attention to Lauren, and his expression and tone shifted immediately to reflect compassion and validation for a woman who had just been publicly humiliated by the person who should have been her strongest supporter and advocate. Steve told Lauren that he wanted her to hear something clearly, and that he wanted everyone in the studio, and everyone watching at home to hear it as well. Steve stated unequivocally that being an elementary school art teacher was not a hobby or a trivial pursuit, but rather was critically important work that shaped children's development and gave them tools for creativity and self-expression that would serve them throughout their lives. Steve spoke about the profound impact that teachers had on students' lives and futures, sharing briefly about educators who had influenced his own development and success in ways that went far beyond academic instruction to include encouragement, inspiration, and belief in his potential when others had written him off. He made clear that measuring the value of work solely through financial compensation was a fundamentally flawed and destructive approach to assessing professional contributions, that there were countless forms of valuable work that society undercompensated financially, but that were essential to community well-being and human flourishing. He told Lauren that her husband's dismissal of her career said nothing about the actual worth or importance of her work, and everything about Brian's character and his fundamental misunderstanding of what made work valuable and what made a person worthy of respect. Steve then returned his attention to Brian with even greater intensity, addressing not just what he had said, but what his words revealed about how he viewed his wife and their partnership. Steve told Brian that his contempt for Lauren's career was destroying not just their marriage, but their children's understanding of what healthy relationships looked like and what it meant to support a partner's choices and ambitions. He described how Emma and Nathan had just watched their father publicly mock and dismiss work that their mother clearly found meaningful and important, how they would carry that moment with them, and how it would shape their understanding of partnership and respect in ways that would affect their own future relationships and professional choices. Steve challenged Brian directly about whether he truly believed that his wife's work educating children was worthless and unimportant, or whether he had simply fallen into a destructive pattern of measuring worth exclusively through income and status, rather than through actual contribution and meaning. He told Brian that regardless of his answer, he needed to recognize that his behavior was unacceptable and damaging, that it constituted a fundamental violation of the respect and support that should characterize any healthy marriage, and that he needed to make immediate changes in how he thought about and spoke about his wife's professional life, or accept that he was actively destroying his marriage and modeling toxic values for his children. Steve made clear that he was not going to continue with the game, while Brian maintained his stance that his mockery of Lauren's career was justified or acceptable. He told Brian that he had a choice to make in this moment about whether he was willing to acknowledge the cruelty and disrespect of what he had said and commit to treating his wife's professional contributions with the respect they deserved, or whether he would continue to defend his right to publicly diminish and mock the person who had chosen to build a life with him and who deserved partnership and support rather than contempt and dismissal. The studio had fallen into complete silence during Steve's confrontation, every person present recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond typical game, show content, or entertainment. Brian's face had shifted from defensive humor to visible discomfort as Steve's words penetrated his usual patterns of rationalization and justification for his treatment of Lauren's career. Michael, Brian's brother, stood with an expression that suggested both surprise at Steve's forceful intervention and perhaps recognition of patterns in his brother's behavior that he had witnessed, but never directly confronted. Brian attempted one more defensive response, suggesting that Steve did not understand the economic realities that made his legal career objectively more valuable than Lauren's teaching position based on market compensation and societal willingness to pay for different types of professional services. Steve cut off this attempt immediately, his voice carrying absolute finality as he stated that there was no economic principle or market reality that justified publicly mocking your spouse's career choice, or suggesting that their work was a hobby rather than legitimate professional contribution. Steve told Brian that he needed to apologize to Lauren immediately and genuinely, not with qualifications about economic realities or market valuations, but with real acknowledgement that his words were cruel and wrong, and that Lauren's work as an educator deserved his respect and support rather than his mockery and dismissal. He made clear that without such an apology, the taping would not continue and that the Harrison family would be asked to leave. Brian stood in silence for a long moment, clearly struggling between his habitual patterns of defending his right to make honest observations about career value and the dawning recognition that his behavior had been called out in the most public way possible, and that everyone present agreed with Steve's assessment rather than his own justifications. Finally, he turned to Lauren with an expression that suggested genuine recognition of the pain he had caused, though whether this represented actual change in his fundamental attitudes or simply tactical response to public pressure remained uncertain. Brian apologized to Lauren for calling her career a hobby and for suggesting that her work was not a real job worthy of respect. His apology was brief and lacked the depth of acknowledgement that Steve had called for, but it represented at least minimal recognition that his words had been inappropriate and hurtful. Lauren accepted the apology with quiet dignity, though her face reflected the pain of years of similar treatment and uncertainty about whether this moment would lead to any genuine change in how Brian viewed and spoke about her professional life moving forward. Steve then addressed both Brian and Lauren together, making clear that what had occurred on the Family Feud stage was a symptom of deeper problems in their marriage that required professional intervention and genuine commitment to change. He connected them with information about marriage counseling resources, emphasizing that their pattern of interaction around Lauren's career was destructive and unsustainable, and that without significant changes, they were heading toward divorce and causing lasting damage to their children's understanding of respect, partnership, and professional value. The game eventually resumed, though the atmosphere had shifted dramatically from lighthearted competition to something far more serious and emotionally charged. Both families completed the match with appropriate effort, though everyone present recognized that the real significance of the taping had nothing to do with game show scores and everything to do with the confrontation of contemptuous behavior, and the powerful message Steve had delivered about respect, support, and the fundamental obligations of partnership in marriage. The Harrison family lost their match, though the outcome felt entirely secondary to the more important events that had transpired. When filming concluded, Steve spent considerable time with Brian and Lauren separately, ensuring that Lauren felt supported and validated after being publicly mocked by her husband. and that Brian understood the seriousness of his behavior and the changes that needed to occur if their marriage was to survive and become healthy rather than continuing as a source of pain and damage for everyone involved. The episode aired with the confrontation included, as Steve and the production team determined that the message about respecting all forms of professional contribution and supporting your partner's career choices was too important to withhold from broadcast. The response from viewers was immediate and overwhelming, with millions expressing appreciation for Steve's willingness to stop the game and address Brian's mockery rather than allowing it to pass without comment or consequence. Countless teachers and others in service professions shared their own experiences of having their work dismissed or mocked by partners or family members who measured value exclusively through income rather than through actual societal contribution or personal meaning. The immediate aftermath of the incident was difficult for the Harrison marriage. Brian was initially defensive about being publicly called out and attempted to frame the situation as an overreaction to his honest assessment of career value rather than recognition of his pattern of disrespectful behavior. However, the overwhelming public response supporting Steve's confrontation and validating Lauren's career made it impossible for Brian to maintain his stance that he had done nothing wrong or that his mockery was justified by economic realities. Lauren used the momentum from Steve's public defense to establish firmer boundaries in her marriage, insisting that Brian attend marriage counseling with her, or that they would need to separate because she could no longer tolerate the level of dismissiveness and contempt that had characterized his treatment of her professional life. Faced with the potential dissolution of his marriage and the public judgment he had experienced following the episode's broadcast, Brian finally agreed to counseling. The therapeutic process was difficult and revealed the depth of Brian's issues with status anxiety, his fundamental misunderstanding of what made work valuable, and his inability to appreciate contributions that did not align with his narrow definition of professional success. He struggled to recognize how his behavior had constituted emotional abuse rather than honest feedback about career realities, but gradually began to understand through professional guidance how his pattern of mockery had damaged Lauren and their marriage. Progress was slow and marked by setbacks, but there was movement toward healthier patterns of interaction and genuine appreciation for Lauren's professional contributions. 1 year after the Family Feud incident, the Harrison marriage remained intact but fundamentally changed from what it had been. Brian had made genuine progress in recognizing the value of Lauren's work and in communicating about career and financial matters without dismissing or mocking her professional choices. Lauren had rebuilt her sense of professional worth through the validation she received from Steve's defense, from the overwhelming public support that followed the episode, and from her own recommitment to the importance and meaning of her work with children. Their children had witnessed not only their father's initial mockery, but also his subsequent apology and efforts to change, providing them with important lessons about accountability and the possibility of growth and improvement even after significant failures. Steve Harvey maintained periodic contact with the Harrison family, checking on their progress and offering continued encouragement and resources. He spoke about the incident in later interviews as an example of why all forms of honest work deserved respect regardless of compensation levels, why supporting your partner's professional choices was a fundamental obligation of marriage, and why measuring human worth exclusively through income was both morally wrong and practically destructive to relationships and family well-being. If this story has reinforced your understanding that all honest work deserves respect regardless of income, that supporting your partner's professional choices is a fundamental obligation of partnership, and that measuring worth exclusively through financial compensation is both wrong and destructive, please take a moment to like this content and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about families and the choices that either strengthen or destroy the partnerships we claim to value.